All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Hi, everybody. My name's Jim Gell, obviously coming to you from inside the university where I still have to be masked up while I'm in the classroom. Glad to see everybody, well, sort of see everybody here on a Monday right before the holidays. Just wanted to give you a quick rundown. I'll introduce our speaker. She'll give you an amazing talk, and then I will field question and answers through the chat function. So make sure you know where the chat is down at the bottom of your screen. And you can chat at any time and I'll feed those questions. So just if they come up to you, go ahead and put it in there, and then I will ask those at the end of the talk. Want to thank our speaker for coming today. Crystal Raymond is a climate adaptation specialist with the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington, has worked in the field of climate science and adaptation since 2010. She conducts research and provides decision support on climate impacts and resilience as it relates to forests, wildfires, and water resources of Pacific Northwest. She has led several climate change vulnerability assessments and resilience plans, including the Washington Department of Natural Resources Plan for Climate Resilience, Chelan County Climate Resilience Strategy, Washington State Parks Climate Adaptation Plan, and climate change vulnerability and adaptation in the North Cascades region. She lives in North Bend, Washington, where she has become a proud small forest landowner, and very apropos if somebody's going to talk about wildfires. Thank you, Crystal, for being here.
Great, thank you for that introduction, and I'm excited to be here. I'm actually on campus as well, but yes, I have recently moved to North Bend, and so when I think about wildfire in forests in Western Washington, I definitely have a different and more personal perspective on that. Now living on a small forest of my own, I'm definitely thinking about what can be done to make sure we're as safe as possible from wildfire. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about kind of three major things. One, kind of our understanding of climate change effects on wildfire west-wide and what we expect in the future. I'll talk a little bit more specifically on why that's a particularly challenging question for the Western Pacific Northwest. And by that, I mean specifically Western Washington and Northwestern Oregon. And then I'll also talk about, kind of given the challenges and the unique role of fire in this region, I'll talk a little bit about what forest landowners and forest managers can do to address wildfire risk in the future. So I want to start by highlighting how much this has been in the news. I think we're all kind of experiencing this quite regularly now, and you really can't get away from the connection between climate change and wildfire in the news, particularly coming off of this year where we had a pretty severe and extensive drought throughout the Northwest, which led to water shortages, greater conflict over water, and also some of the biggest wildfires that the West has experienced in recent history, including a very large fire in California and also in southwestern Oregon. And that comes on the heels of the year before that, where we also had extreme wildfires in western Oregon. And I also, I skipped a slide there. I want to acknowledge a little bit the what I've been calling climate whiplash that we're all experiencing right now. For those of you who may be a little more familiar with Northwestern Washington and up into Vancouver and British Columbia and what they've experienced the last couple weeks, we know that it's really hard at this point even to be thinking about drought and wildfire in places like this, because right now they're dealing with too much water. But I think this sort of climate whiplash or extremes of what we experienced this summer, and now these extreme flooding events and landslides that have been triggered in Vancouver and near Vancouver in Northwestern Washington are very clear examples of the types of extremes that we expect to be worse with climate change. So there's multiple lines of evidence, and it's quite clear from science that climate change has increased wildfire activity throughout the West, and that is expected to continue in the future with continued warming. And I want to start by maybe just breaking down some of the connections and the ways that climate relates to wildfire. So, aside from climate change, just understanding the connection. So certainly our temperatures, hotter temperatures in spring and summer are related to more wildfire. The precipitation that we get really matters, both how much we get in the spring and summer and how quickly rain returns in the fall. At higher elevations, we know that snowpack can play a role in terms of how quickly it melts and how much that exposes the vegetation to drying for a longer period of time. And all these different factors primarily contribute to wildfire activity by drying the vegetation or fuels. And this term is often called aridity. So increasing the aridity of the landscape, which contributes to a greater potential for wildfires to spread. Also, just kind of briefly mention that many of the wildfires that we experience in the West are in fact not in forests. They're in grasslands or shrub steppe environments. And so another important climate control in those environments is actually the amount of fuels. And more and precipitation in the springtime can result in more grasses or fine vegetation growing, which can actually contribute to more wildfire activity in those types of environments. And so for most of these kind of factors, climate factors that contribute to wildfire activity, climate change is expected to worsen conditions. So we expect to see hotter summers and also drier summers, which could lead to increasing fuel aridity across the West. At higher elevations, less snowpack and earlier melting of that snowpack, which can contribute to a longer fire season in those areas. And then also with this factor that I mentioned in terms of the grass and the fine fuels, we actually expect to see potentially more precipitation in the spring and winter in the West, which can contribute to more fine fuel growth and actually higher wildfire activity in those ecosystems. So I want to highlight one key paper, I think, that really makes the link pretty conclusively between climate change and wildfire. And what's particularly unique about this study is that it is actually an attribution study. So it kind of goes one step beyond just looking at, climate is changing, temperatures are getting warmer, and we're getting more wildfire activity in the Western US, but actually showing through modeling how those two factors are linked. So what you see in this graph is the red lines are kind of our observed conditions. This is throughout the Western US. The top is looking at the length of the fire weather season, and the bottom is looking at days of high fire danger. And so the red are observations, and then the black is basically modeling without the effect of human-caused climate change. And what you can see, the main take-home point is that the red and the black lines start to diverge more recently, which is basically saying that without the signal of human-caused climate change, we cannot account for the observations in the length of the fire season and the increase in the number of days with high fire danger that we've seen across the West. And so this paper actually goes on to make some pretty conclusive statements about that, saying that human-caused climate change has contributed about 50% of the increase in fuel aridity across the Western US, and contributing about 4.2 million hectares of forest fire area during that time. So pretty significant impact. We know that climate change is definitely not the only factor that contributes to the greater amount of fire activity that we've seen across the West. But what this paper demonstrates is that it is a factor contributing to what we're experiencing. And so now I want to kind of talk a little bit about the future and also point out the uniqueness of the Western Pacific Northwest. So This map here is a burned area by wildfires, 1984 to 2015. And the main point that I want to highlight is kind of two things. One is, this large area of wildfire really happening in, there's this big area in Idaho, and then this area in kind of central to eastern Washington, and then also down here in California. So when we talk about increasing wildfire activity across the West, these are the areas that are really contributing to those trends, and really some of the most significant burning that scientists are referring to. Also, you'll notice is actually quite an absence of wildfire in the recent record for this area that I'm mostly going to be talking about. So that's Western Washington and Northwestern Oregon. And really, I think in this map, it's pretty striking what an absence of area burn there is in that area. And although this is a very short record. And I also want to acknowledge that this goes through 2015. If we created this map now, we know that there's quite some additional area burned here in Western Oregon due to the fires in 2020. So a bit of a change here, but nonetheless, the point that there's really something unique going on, and the role of wildfire is different in this part of the Western Pacific Northwest. And so, when we talk about those relationships and the increase in fuel aridity that we've observed over the last few decades, we're really talking about these types of forest environments. So pretty dry interior forests. These forests are adapted to wildfire. Wildfire is, has historically been more frequent than it is. And now we're starting to see additional fire activity, larger area burned in these areas. It's also important to recognize that the role of fire is very different in these systems, and that historically it was typically more frequent fires, but of fairly low severity. And so we know the other factor, and that's playing a big role in these forest types, is forest management, where forest management has in some cases resulted in a buildup of fuels. Basically keeping fire out of these systems has actually also increased to fire activity. And also a selection towards tree species that are less adapted to fire. Also, not forgetting about our shrub, steppe, and grassland environments that we have throughout the West. Also to acknowledge that, much of the fire activity we're talking about is increased in these areas, again, related to climate change, and also the management of grasslands is contributing to that with things such as invasive species and grazing practices. So nonetheless, as we think forward about how climate change affects wildfire in the future, most studies, again, looking kind of west-wide, indicate an increase in wildfire activity as a result of climate change. So one of the major factors we look at is area burned, and projections of area burned are expected to increase throughout the Western United States as a result of climate change, basically this greater fuel aridity. But again, you can see, there's actually kind of an absence of that in this map. And we generally see, even in kind of these orange areas here, not quite as good of a relationship between climate change and wildfire activity. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And I also do want to point out that, it's not just area burned. We also know that there's a number of ways we'd expect climate change to contribute to more wildfire activity, and that includes longer fire seasons and generally a kind of a greater climatic potential for wildfire. So even, regardless of what happens with the vegetation or fuels or ignitions, what we see here is kind of an increase in the number of fire danger days. And so this is, we're looking here in the short term at the 2020s, we start to see a little bit of an increase in the number of days with high potential for wildfire simply because of the climate conditions. And then that increases further in the future. And also for differences we see for a low and high climate change scenario. So a study that I'm working on now that I just want to kind of mention briefly is looking more specifically at forest fires in this area we call Western Cascadia, and trying to understand more specifically what truly are the climate drivers and climate connections for wildfire in those regions. And given the sort of unique climate controls on wildfire here, how might the potential for wildfire change in the future with climate change? So, what's different about this study is really kind of digging into that specific area that is sometimes kind of the exception in the more West-wide studies that are done. And the reason we focus on this is not just because we're scientists who, are always interested in the exception to the rule, but also because it matters for understanding what it is that we can do to plan and prepare for the impacts of wildfire. So to say a little bit about kind of how wildfire is unique in this region in Western Washington, I just want to, many of you are living in this area are probably quite aware of what our forests are like here. But, a major difference to really point out is that these are naturally heavy fuels, so naturally very dense forests. A lack of vegetation or fuels to burn is really not a problem in these forests. It's there. And they're not adapted to fire in sort of the sense of of trees that can easily survive wildfire, but they are adapted in the sense of being able to regenerate after wildfire, at least typically in the absence of things like climate change or development. And summers are typically dry, but not as dry as throughout much of the Western US. And so the fire regime, typical of this area, so this is kind of the classic or sort of standard role that fire plays in Western Washington. And mostly I'm talking here about kind of these gray areas along the coast and in the Cascades. And typically it's an infrequent high severity fire regime. So by that we mean very long periods of time between fire in one place, on the order of 200 to 600 years between fire, and that when fires do occur, they typically burn very large areas. Very large fires on the order of 1 million acres have been documented in the past, in the more distant past, so not necessarily in our observational record, but in the more distant past. We see evidence of fires that large, and that they often burn and kill a high proportion of the trees in the area. So, what I was just describing, that's kind of the historical role of fires in Western Washington. So very large fires. These are actually images of fires in Western Oregon, Northwestern Oregon in 2020. And, another sort of common characteristic of these very large fires, which has been, pretty well studied in the last year, is really emphasizing how much they are wind-driven events. So they typically burn in an east wind event where we have very hot, dry, fast-moving winds coming from the interior to the coast. And, some evidence from the wildfires in 2020, for example, showed that something like 90% of the area burned in those fires burned in just a 24-hour period when those winds were blowing and were really able to carry the fires long distances. And so that's really kind of one of the major unique conditions under which we get very large wildfires in Northwestern Oregon and Western Washington. But I think one of the things that I've really learned in doing this research, and I've become sort of reached a place where I really appreciate more and acknowledge more, is recognizing that not all fires in Western Washington are the same. And we know that there's also smaller fires, less than 25,000 acres, that can be much more frequent. And, sort of I'm an ecologist by training, from an ecological perspective, these fires are often considered not particularly ecologically consequential. And when we look at long records of wildfire in this region, they can kind of be erased by forest management or other wildfires. But in the more contemporary record, obviously we know that they exist, that they happen, and that they can be very consequential for people and communities. So it doesn't take a large, fast-moving West Side fire to have major impacts for people, for emergency response, for community preparedness. And so we know that these fires are important to understand as well. And so part of what the research that we're working on right now is to try to understand, whether or not the climatic drivers of these types of fires are different, and to what extent they can occur, say, in very dry conditions, even in the absence of major winds. And so finally, I want to just kind of shift gears here and talk a little bit about, given this sort of different role of wildfire in the Western Pacific Northwest, recognizing that the sort of natural condition of fire, or the historical condition of wildfire, is really very large, often fast-moving wildfires, with many trees killed during that fire. Then what does that mean for how we can plan and prepare for these events? And also recognizing that there are these other smaller wildfires that may play into the way that we think about planning and preparing for wildfire. So I think there's kind of four major sort of buckets of actions that I talk about. So two of these are really about before a wildfire. So thinking about ways that we can protect people, community, and high value resources. Thinking a little bit more about emergency response and preparedness. There's also sort of a during action. And so this is really kind of during the fire season, as opposed to during a wildfire specifically, but recognizing there's kind of some very near-term actions during the fire season, and then after the wildfire. Or I'll say a little bit more about that. I say after the wildfire, but I think this is really kind of planning for after the wildfire before they occur. So, one of the classic things that we hear for preparing for wildfires in the Western US is thinking about fire-wise principles or vegetation management around homes. So reducing fuels to protect homes, to protect resources. And this is very commonly used and has a lot of application throughout much of the West. How effective this is in Western Pacific Northwest is less clear. And really, most emphasis now is really recognizing, immediately around homes that this can be effective. I'm thinking about the materials of homes themselves. And kind of, if you look at this sort of typical fire-wise figure, really kind of looking at this orange and red areas as being the particularly most important areas to focus on. Kind of moving further out into the forest around the house, it's less clear that it makes sense to be doing vegetation management in those areas, just because of our naturally dense forests, and because particularly in these very fast moving, very large wildfire events, it's not clear that that's going to be effective in protecting homes. The other category is sort of emergency response and preparedness. And given the potential for these very large wildfires, we know that there's always more that can be done for emergency response. I'm thinking about how we evacuate, evacuation routes, what's going to be done during an event. And a lot of that can be done with early preparation, similar to the way that we plan and prepare for a big earthquake in this region. During the fire season, I think maintaining that situational awareness, understanding how our region is faring. So there's these significant wildland fire potential outlooks that are issued every month during the fire season. When we really see this region here highlight as having, red above normal wildland fire potential, that's really time to be paying attention and recognizing that we really need to be careful about the activities that we're doing and whether or not that can contribute to wildfire risk. And then the fourth and last is really thinking about post-fire planning and management. So, we know that these are in some ways going to be opportunities that a lot of decisions that are made immediately after a fire in terms of how we manage the landscape is going to be really important to setting the future trajectory. So in the near term, thinking about how we are protecting for erosion, landslides, and protecting things like water quality and water supply. And then also thinking about the vegetation, where and when and how forests might be replanted, and also considering where that seed source is going to come from if we're talking about covering large areas, and what sort of trajectory do we want to set the forest on. And again, bringing in climate change here, I think this is really an opportunity to see some of these events as a way that we can influence that trajectory moving forward. So that's a summary of what I have, and hopefully I have left time to take some of your questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Crystal. That was wonderful. So folks, if you have questions, please chat them and we will feed them to our speaker. You guys have any questions in the room right now? Nothing yet? Okay. I had one to start us off. So I was wondering how 2021 looked like in Western Washington. Did it actually reach the sort of high fire danger thing? Because I didn't see, there seemed to be talk about it, but I didn't see a whole bunch of actions that suggested that we were protecting ourselves against potentially fire during the fire season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this fire season was a little bit better. I mean, there was a widespread drought throughout the Pacific Northwest. Conditions were abnormally dry, especially coming off the heat wave, obviously pretty extreme conditions there. And there was some sort of elevated fire potential, but not as extreme as what we experienced kind of at the end of summer, the beginning of September in 2020. So a little bit better conditions, but certainly some elevated fire risk compared to a normal year. And I think interesting to see that we were maybe somewhat lucky. We heard lots of reports and descriptions of trees and vegetation being really heavily affected by the heat wave, with kind of immediate dying of vegetation. I mean, vegetation that was like scorched, sort of, as opposed to drought stress, which can take longer to emerge. And I think in some ways we were lucky that we didn't quite get the short-term fire weather conditions that could have really made that a pretty sort of explosive situation.
Yeah, and I'm very curious as to sort of local decision makers. So I'm thinking along the policy side of things, and decisions to go ahead with big fireworks displays and things along those lines, even during like some of the worst heat part of what was going on. So I don't know if it wasn't if it was because we weren't quite in that complete fire danger area, or it was just sort of that assumption that Western Washington would be fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's actually a really good reminder. So one of the things that we did see, speaking of that fire potential outlook, the wildland fire potential outlook map that I showed with the red. So immediately after that heat wave, which was in the end of June, the next outlook that came out did actually show Western Washington and Northwestern Oregon as having elevated fire potential. So that would have been at like the beginning of July. And then it actually went down for later in the season, because I think that was sort of in response and reaction to that heat wave and how extreme things were in June. And so I think, at that time, I would have expected to see a little more kind of cautious policy, I guess, or I don't know how to kind of say that, but we knew there was. I do remember hearing about a number of different debates about banning fireworks. In some places it was done, in some places it wasn't. But I think part of it was just that came so early in the season that people hadn't quite wrapped their heads around it being like severe fire season yet at the beginning of July, because typically that's something in this region we're seeing at the end of August. And so I think that was partly what happened. People were just not quite able to think about it yet. And then it actually did go down a bit, not because we got that much more rain, but I think it just wasn't as extreme as it was coming off of that heat wave. But that being said, I also, I really have started to hear people just sort of individual behavior change where people are starting to say, I can go camping in Western Washington and I don't necessarily need to have a campfire. And, I can sort of reimagine my relationship with some of these things that may cause fire risk in our region. And so I think we're starting to see both a recognition that this is a fire prone region, even if it doesn't happen as often, but also, a recognition that, maybe some of the behavioral changes that we need to account for that may, not be that, difficult for us as a society to embrace.
Cool. Great answer. Had a question from let's see if I can find it again. I lost it. Maureen wants to know, what kinds of fire-wise steps are you considering around your own property in North Bend?
That's a great question, Maureen. Yeah, so I have to admit I've just moved, and right now we've been dealing with some pretty crazy atmospheric rivers and heavy rain events. So, haven't started doing any sort of fire-wise things, but I think, the types of things that I'm really looking at is, really, I'm going to put into practice this idea of the immediately around my home. So, I have a great forest. I want to maintain that forest, but a little bit further from the house, just to kind of create that buffer. So, it doesn't necessarily stop the embers or the fire from moving to the house, but it can increase the chances of, firefighters protecting the house in these small to moderate fires, not the big wind-driven ones, but the smaller ones that may have a potential of protecting that home if the fire comes close. I'm thinking about the vegetation that I plant. So more native vegetation that is more able to stay green in the summertime to hopefully create a little bit more of a moisture environment around there. And then some of the very classic fire-wise things that don't even depend on managing the vegetation are, keeping your wood pile away from your house, right? So looking at everything around our house and how can we keep it away? Because often what happens is, it's actually the embers that fall on those things and then create a fire. And then that's, what gets your house. One challenge that I feel is about the grass. So, we're lucky to have a lawn. Here's kind of where we have to think about the different aspects of the different trade-offs in climate adaptation actions. So, keeping our grass green and our lawn green and watered throughout the summer would actually provide some fire protection benefits, but it's a use of water that may not be necessary when we have low water supply in the summertime. So that's something that I think I'm going to kind of have to wrestle with personally and see whether or not that makes sense. Yep. And then, the last thing I'll say about that is generally my largest forest as a whole, we're really looking at species diversity and reducing invasive species.
So which invasive species are kind of your most problem child for fire?
Yeah, so the most problem child invasive species is Scotch broom. The brooms, which we know because of the way the vegetation dies, it can be very dense around the plant and carry fire. I've heard anecdotally that Himalayan blackberry, some of the invasive blackberries actually carry fire quite easily, and I've heard DNR telling stories. DNR telling stories about fires that are able to carry in the wildland urban interface along these blackberry. So those are the ones that I think are most important to focus on. We've got other invasive species that just contribute to kind of more dense vegetation than I would like to see on our land.
Gotcha. Somebody asks, how does wildfire affect water quality and water supply? You mentioned that in your talk.
Yeah, so for a number of the big municipal water suppliers are really looking at this issue because it requires greater filtration, greater treatment of water once you have a wildfire, because you have more sediment, more turbidity, more material, often if you have surface water reservoirs coming in. So there can definitely be a short-term impact that affects water quality. I know that the EPA and others working in Portland are really trying to understand how those in Oregon, how those wildfires in 2020 really affected water quality. But there's definitely a period of time, at least immediately after a fire, where the water quality has to be really closely monitored because the runoff is really changing. What's coming off the landscape is, different materials. And then also just given other things that burn, that has the potential to put pollutants into the runoff that's then coming kind of faster off these landscapes as we've removed some of the vegetation. So there's a real immediate impact. And I think, we're also trying to understand some of the longer term impacts of that.
Excellent. I think there was a clarification question on one of your slides. You were talking about fuel aridity, and the question was, is it higher or lower fuel aridity that shows susceptibility to wildfires?
Right. So more arid fuels, drier conditions. So I guess that would be higher fuel aridity. I don't like that word because it is a challenging word, but so drier conditions, like generally for most of the West, it's, more arid fuels enable fires to spread more easily. The one exception is those grassland environments where it's actually wetter conditions actually can produce more grasses that kind of creates a continuous layer of fuels and enables fires to move through grasslands more easily.
Cool, thank you. Let's see, another question. How might people in urban environments that might not be at direct risks of wildfire prepare for some of the indirect impacts, such as air quality and health?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I didn't talk about the smoke aspect of it. And that's something, we can certainly get major smoke events, and it doesn't even have to be in the Pacific Northwest. We've been getting smoke from California, British Columbia in different years. So there's a lot of work now on understanding indoor air quality filtering. I think it's King County has got some great resources on things like box fans and filters and ways to kind of monitor your own air quality inside. Again, thinking about sensitive populations and, what maybe keeping people who are particularly sensitive to poor air quality inside, and then thinking about that air quality management inside. And I think there's also kind of a, sort of a recognition that has to go along with understanding the role of wildfire in the West. And that is, we often expect our recreation experience not to be interrupted by wildfire smoke. And I think that that's maybe just not something that's really feasible if we're going to live with having wildfire in the West. And to some extent, it's a natural part of the system. We're going to have to learn how to live with it. And so we may need to, think about the way that we recreate and our expectation of views and our expectation of a smoke-free environment isn't necessarily something that is a reasonable expectation for living in the West. And there's evidence that, before a lot of settlement, European settlement, that this was quite a smoky place to be living, that there was a lot of wildfire naturally and from Native American burning, and that would have been a part of living here. And I think it's sort of understanding how we kind of protect our own health and protect sensitive people, but that we may need to kind of change our relationship with that.
You mentioned sort of how we plant forests is potentially having some role. So how are like forest managers or private companies actually addressing the idea of making either a forest that can deal with wildfire or potentially doesn't have as high a likelihood as causing wildfire?
Yeah, and so this is one of those options that is really, particularly relevant in the more drier fire environments. So Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon, places in Idaho. And so it's really favoring species that are more fire resistant. So a lot of pine species are a lot more fire resistant, those that have bigger bark. So, prior to a lot of large scale forest management, those sorts of species would have naturally been favored by more frequent wildfires. And, they have been kind of selected against. And so we want to increase the presence of fire adapted species. And then also it's the density of the forest. So, reducing tree density so that a fire can burn through, but will be a slower moving, what we call a lower severity fire. So, killing less of the trees. And so that's kind of reducing the density of the forest overall. We also know that, deciduous trees can play a role too in kind of breaking up the environment. They often tend to create a little bit wetter area and have the potential to kind of hold moisture and maybe kind of slow down the fire spread or dampen the fire effects a little bit. So increasing the amount of deciduous trees in the forest can also contribute to that.
Cool. We got another question, which I think you sort of addressed, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about. Does logging contribute to greater fire risk? I guess it's kind of a short-term versus longer-term question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've seen a lot about this. And I think you kind of have to see if I can talk about it without kind of getting into the weeds too much, but I'd say it depends on how the logging is done, right? So there's certainly ways in which it does, and that is if the forest is really dense afterwards. So often planting after harvesting can be really create really dense forests. That's going to increase fire risk. If the forest is very similar sizes, similar tree species, that just creates this homogeneous forest that does enable fire to spread more easily. But those are decisions about how you plant or how you manage forests. And in cutting trees, logging, harvesting trees doesn't necessarily have to lead to that. So, incorporating some more diversity, some species diversity, some, different sizes, ages of trees, kind of making that less homogeneous across an area, you can still have harvesting without necessarily contributing to that. I also want to point out that there is, I was on a paper that is hopefully coming out soon that, kind of looked at some of the harvested areas in Western Oregon in the 2020 fires. And again, when we're in the situation of these extremely fast moving, wind driven fires on the west side, evidence is that it doesn't matter if it's been logged or, how that forest has been managed at that point. These fires are really just burning everything. And so there's also kind of an exception on that end in that particular type of environment that probably logging or forest management isn't necessarily making a difference.
Cool. Well, I don't see any more questions. So thank you very much. This was wonderful talk. And for those of you out there, we did record this talk, so I'll have the link to that if anybody wants to share it with anybody else. You can email me at jimgawel, JIMGAWEL @uw.edu, and I'll get you that link as soon as it's available in a day or two. And thank you for a wonderful talk. For those of you who are coming to the different talks in this series, we'll see you on Monday at 12:30 for our next talk from the city of Tacoma, talking about what they're up to as far as climate adaptation and climate planning. And Crystal, thank you very much.
Great.
For everything.
Thank you so much.
Good luck with your North Bend forest.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.